98 of the world's most dangerous soldiers walked into that canyon believing they were the hunters. They were wrong. Within 4 minutes, every radio went dead. Within 6, the first men started dying. Hidden guns tore through body armor like it was paper. Mortars walked down the valley in perfect sequence. Someone had rehearsed this. Someone had planned this. And somewhere buried inside an enemy command bunker, a finger was moving toward a single button that would collapse the entire mountain range and bury 100 soldiers alive beneath 10,000 tons of frozen rock. Nobody saw the woman watching from above. Nobody counted her. That was the last mistake they ever made. If this story finds you, wherever you are in the world, hit follow, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. Now let's begin. The cold came first. It always did up here. Not the polite cold of city winters or the manageable chill of early morning. This was Ravenspine cold. The kind that moved through Gore-Tex and ceramic plate like they weren't there. The kind that settled into the joints of your fingers and made fine motor skills a memory. At 4,000 meters above sea level, the Ravenspine Pass carved a brutal path between two ranges that looked, on a satellite image, like the jaws of something ancient and patient. Elena Cross had been lying still in that cold for 11 hours. She didn't move. She barely breathed. Beneath 2 layers of white-gray camouflage netting and a thermal suppression blanket that smelled faintly of chemical solvent, she occupied a shallow depression in the frozen rock approximately 90 meters below the ridge crest. Her spotter, Sergeant Dale Okafor, was pressed against the stone 3 feet to her left. Between them sat the thermal observation scope, a field radio on encrypted channel 4, 2 liters of water that were slowly losing the battle against the temperature, and a rangefinder whose battery had been dying for the past hour. She had not told anyone about the battery. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope mounted on her rifle, a Chaytak M200 chambered in .408, serial number filed to nothing per unit protocol. Elena was watching the canyon floor 1,140 meters below. The math lived in her head the way other people carried songs. Distance, temperature differential, current barometric reading from the wrist altimeter, wind at her elevation versus wind at target level, which were almost never the same thing, the Coriolis correction for this latitude, the ammunition's muzzle velocity against today's air density. She had run those numbers so many times they no longer felt like arithmetic. They felt like breathing. Down in the canyon, Colonel Marcus Reed's column was 22 minutes from the mouth of Ravenspine Pass. The mission brief had been clean. Too clean, Elena thought, in the way that missions sometimes presented themselves when the people writing the intelligence summary were more concerned with getting approval than getting it right. Underground Weapons Complex. Tier 1 target. Coalition Special Operations Force of 98 personnel, a multinational stack drawn from 4 different countries, embedded advisors, a signals element, 2 demolition teams, and a quick reaction force that would hold at the pass entrance while the strike element went in. Intelligence rated the complex as lightly defended, a skeleton crew of technical personnel and maybe 24 security contractors. The chemical weapons stored inside were the real threat, not the guards. Get in. Secure the facility, call in the disposal team. 40 minutes, max. Elena had read the brief 3 times on the helicopter insertion. She'd flagged 2 things to Okafor during the ride up, shouting over the rotors with her head close to his. Imagery's 48 hours old. I know, he said, and there's no thermal data on those ridge positions. North face, east face, nothing. Intel said the ridges are clear. Intel said a lot of things about the last place we worked. Okafor had given her a look that said he agreed with her and couldn't do anything about it. That was the look. She knew it well. She'd been getting some version of it for 6 years, the particular expression worn by people who respected your instincts and had absolutely no power to act on them. So she'd done what she always did. She arrived early, dug into her position while it was still dark, and started watching. 11 hours of watching. And the thing she was watching most closely, in the final 40 minutes before Reed's column entered the kill zone, was the silence. Okafor. Yeah. Ravens. He shifted slightly behind his scope. What about them? There were 4 working the thermals on the north face this morning. Gone now. A pause. Wind changed. Wind hasn't changed. She kept her eye on the scope. Ravens don't leave a thermal column because the wind shifts. Something moved them. Another pause, longer this time. You want me to push that up? He asked. Push it up. He keyed the radio. Got static. Tried the alternate frequency. More static. Switched to the emergency burst channel and transmitted a short-coded contact report. 3 clicks, a pause, 2 clicks, that would register on Reed's signals element as a caution flag. No acknowledgement. They're not receiving, Okafor said. Elena finally pulled her eye from the scope and looked at him. His face told her what she already knew. Try again, she said. He tried again, and again. And then he held up the radio so she could see the signal meter. Not low, not degraded. 0. A flat line where signal strength should have been. Active jamming. Someone was already running an electronic warfare package against the column. She pressed her eye back to the scope and swept the ridgelines with deliberate slowness. North face. South face. The jagged crown of rock above the canyon's western entrance. And then she saw it. Or rather, she saw the absence of it. A section of rock formation on the northern ridge where the shadow pattern was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the way a painting is wrong when the artist has copied a photograph but doesn't understand how light actually behaves. The shadows were falling slightly off the angle the morning sun should have produced, because those rocks weren't rocks. North Ridge, she said quietly. I've got to hide. 40 meters below the crest. And she moved the scope. East face, there. Another one. They're dug in, Okafor. They've been there for days. How many guns? I can't confirm yet, but they're not pointed at each other. Below the canyon was still empty. Still silent. Reed's column was maybe 15 minutes from the entrance. We have to warn them, Okafor said. I know. Keep trying the radio. She was already moving her scope to the canyon floor, tracing the geography of the ground Reed's men would cross. Rock formations, drainage channels, the rubble field in the center that would be the most tempting avenue of movement. That was when she saw the wires. They were thin, almost invisible against frozen gravel. You would never see them on foot unless you were looking specifically for them, and nobody looked specifically for ground-level wires when they were moving fast and taking fire. The wires ran along the base of the canyon's eastern wall in a shallow groove that might have been natural erosion, might have been intentional. They disappeared around a bend in the cliff face. Elena followed the wire with her eye, and her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wire didn't lead to the weapons complex. It led to the canyon walls. They're going to drop the cliffs, she said. Okafor stopped trying the radio. What? Those aren't tripwires. Look at the spacing. Look at where they terminate. She moved the scope, pointing with her words because she couldn't take her hands off the rifle. Pre-placed charges, linear pattern along both walls. If they detonate, the overhangs collapse. The entire canyon floor fills with rubble. Everyone inside gets buried. The silence between them lasted about 3 seconds. The ambush is just to get them in position, Okafor said. And hold them there. She took a breath. The ambush is the cage. The explosives are the door. Below, the first element of Reed's column appeared at the canyon entrance. Small figures at this distance, moving in good tactical spacing, weapons up, scanning. Professional. Careful. Walking into something no amount of professionalism or care was going to help them with. She keyed her own radio. Nothing. She tried the emergency burst channel. Nothing. She tried the satellite uplink they were supposed to use only in extreme circumstances and got a tone that indicated the frequency was blocked. She looked at Okafor. He was already looking at her. I have 1 shot at the command element, she said. 1 shot to interrupt their timing before they trigger the ambush. But the moment I fire, every gun on those ridges is going to rotate to this position. You'll be exposing us to the counter-sniper element. Yes. They've been up here for days. They know exactly where an Overwatch position would be. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The column's still moving. I know. She settled behind the rifle. Get down behind the rock. Don't move until I tell you. Elena. Dale. Get down. He got down. Yeah, Through the scope, the command bunker was partially visible where a section of camouflage netting had pulled loose at one corner. Someone had been careless, or maybe overconfident. Elena could see the hardened aperture, the faint metallic glint of a radio antenna, and the heat signature bleeding from a ventilation slot. She couldn't see the commander inside. She didn't need to. She needed the command element disrupted, equipment damaged, the triggerman's concentration shattered at the exact moment the ambush was supposed to initiate. Distance, 1,143 meters, refined from her earlier estimate. Elevation drop, significant. The bunker sat roughly 60 meters below her firing position. Wind. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds and felt it against the exposed skin above her collar. Consistent from the northwest, approximately 4 to 6 knots at her level. At canyon floor level, the stone walls would create a different pattern. She'd been observing the heat shimmer for hours, and she had a working model of the airflow that she trusted within acceptable margins. Temperature, minus 14 Celsius. Air density low. She dialed the corrections into her scope's elevation turret, then made a final windage adjustment that she held in her head rather than dialing in, because she didn't fully trust the turret at this temperature. Her breathing slowed without her instructing it to. That was the thing people on the outside didn't understand about this work. You didn't force your body into stillness. You didn't fight your heartbeat or command your lungs to stop. You reached a state of such complete focus that the body quieted on its own, because every resource was allocated to the single task in front of you. And there was nothing left over for nervousness or hesitation or the part of your brain that whispered about consequences. She squeezed. The rifle moved back into her shoulder. The muzzle blast was sharp in the thin air. 1,143 meters downrange, the heavy match bullet struck the bunker's hardened outer panel and punched through a ventilation grill with enough residual energy to spray metal fragments across the interior. She saw, through the scope, watching the splash, a figure stumble. Equipment scatter, the radio antenna bend and go dark. And then the canyon exploded. Not from the charges in the wall. Not yet. The ambush. 8 heavy machine guns opened from concealed positions along the ridgelines, their fire converging on the canyon floor in interlocking patterns that left no dead ground. The sound hit Elena a full second after the muzzles lit up, a rolling, sustained thunder that bounced between the cliff walls and became its own kind of disorientation. Mortars followed within 3 seconds, walking in from the canyon entrance toward the center in pairs, precise and methodical. The work of someone who had pre-registered every grid reference in the kill zone. Reed's columns scattered. She watched operators go flat behind boulders, watched muzzle flashes answer from the canyon floor, disciplined bursts toward the ridge positions, almost certainly ineffective at this range against hardened bunkers but tactically correct. Return fire, find cover, maintain cohesion. They were good. The best. And they were also completely trapped inside a perfect ambush with no air support and no communications and nowhere to go. Her single shot had disrupted the triggerman for perhaps 40 seconds. That was all. She swept her scope back to the command bunker. The antenna was still dark. Figures were moving inside. She could see the heat bloom through the ventilation slot. They were recovering. They were going to reach the trigger. She needed another shot. And that was when the rock 3 feet above her head disintegrated. The counter-sniper's round arrived with no warning, the way supersonic impacts always did. First the crack and impact of the bullet, then half a heartbeat later the distant boom of the rifle that fired it. The stone fragments cut across the back of Elena's left hand and the side of her neck, shallow cuts that bled immediately in the cold. She rolled sideways on instinct, moving left, pressing flat behind a different section of rock as a second round struck exactly where she'd been lying. They had her position. Of course they did. She'd fired a suppressed but not silent rifle from a fixed position against a prepared enemy who had specifically placed counter-sniper elements to deal with the threat she represented. She was surprised she'd gotten 2 shots instead of 1. She pressed against the rock and took 3 long breaths. Okafor was behind her, lower, tight against the cliff. She could hear him, but not see him. "I'm up," she said quietly. "Those are precision rounds," he said. "Not spray and pray. There's at least 1 trained shooter up here." "I know." She pulled her body tighter and thought. The counter-sniper had her suppressed position. Moving would expose her. Staying would get her shot the moment she looked around the rock. She had one advantage. She knew where the enemy triggerman was. And the counter-sniper must, whoever they were, was focused on her position, not the canyon below. She needed a different angle to the bunker. There was a notch in the rock formation 7 meters to her right. She'd cataloged it during her first hour on the ridge because she'd considered it as a primary position before deciding the current location gave better field of view. The notch would give her a firing lane to the bunker's eastern face, not the western aperture she'd used before. It would require her to cross 7 meters of open ground while a trained counter-sniper sat behind a scope aimed at this position. She looked at the ground between her and the notch. Gravel, ice. 2 small rocks that would provide maybe 30 centimeters of cover if she was moving horizontally. Okafor, I need you to do something. Say it. 40 meters north of my position, on the ridgeline. You'll see a dark shadow under the overhang. That's where the counter-sniper is sitting. I need you to put 3 rounds into that shadow on my mark. You won't hit him. The angle's wrong, but I need his head down for 6 seconds. She heard him shift, heard the sound of him moving the secondary rifle, the patrol carbine they carried as the backup weapon, and cycling the bolt. I'm set, he said. 3 seconds. Mark. He opened fire. Not spray, not panic. 3 measured shots at the shadow she'd described, and the counter-sniper's next round went 4 feet over her head because the shooter had instinctively dipped at incoming fire, which was what trained snipers did when they were being engaged by a position that wasn't quite right for a threat. Elena ran, 7 meters of frozen rock, crouching, not upright, moving in a broken lateral pattern because the difference between a diagonal sprint and a straight sprint was whether you arrived or whether you got hit. She reached the notch and pressed herself into it, and the counter-sniper's next round hit the spot she'd just vacated. Close. Very close. But she was in the notch, and through a 40-centimeter gap between 2 rock faces, she could see the eastern face of the command bunker. The antenna was up again. Not the first antenna, a backup antenna. Thinner, military grade. Someone inside that bunker had found the secondary radio kit and was back in communication with the ambush team. She had maybe 2 minutes before the trigger command went out. She pressed the rifle into the notch and began running the numbers from the new position. Different angle. The notch compressed her movement and forced her to shoot from a position that was neither prone nor kneeling, but something in between, her weight distributed across her left knee and right foot, the rifle resting against the rock face rather than a bipod or her own body. It was not a position that appeared in any marksmanship manual she'd read. It would have to work anyway. New distance, 870 meters, shorter than before because the notch was positioned slightly further south along the ridge. New angle, more direct. The eastern face of the bunker wasn't armored the same way the western face was. She could see a panel seam where the prefabricated hardened sections joined, and the seam told her something about the construction, civilian-grade welding, not military spec. The kind of construction work that happened when someone was hiding a project from military oversight while using military materials. Below the seam, at what would be approximately interior floor level, there was a ventilation slot that faced east. She aimed for the slot. 2 more rounds from the counter-sniper hit the rock above the notch and rained stone dust across her back, but the notch itself was holding. The geometry was protecting her, and the counter-sniper was working from an angle that required them to hit a 40-centimeter gap at over 800 meters. Possible, but not easy. She slowed her breathing. Inside the bunker, the commander was reaching for the trigger, or someone else was, whoever the commander had designated as backup when the first man went down from her initial shot. It was standard procedure. You didn't have one trigger man for an operation this size. You had primary and secondary, and probably tertiary, because good military planners accounted for losses. She needed to destroy the trigger apparatus, not just disrupt the man holding it. She looked at the slot again. The wiring she'd seen on the canyon floor had to terminate somewhere inside that bunker. A detonation control panel, a firing board, something with physical switches, and a power source. If the slot opened into the room where that equipment sat, and if a .408 caliber match round entered through that slot and ricocheted off a hardened interior surface at the right angle, the probabilities were not good. She fired anyway. The round went through the slot. 3 seconds passed. Then the backup antenna went dark. She didn't know if she'd destroyed the firing board. She didn't know if she'd hit anyone. She only knew the antenna was dark and the wires in the canyon floor had not detonated, and below her, Colonel Reed's column was still fighting. Still alive. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold rifle stock and let herself have exactly that, one moment of acknowledgement, before she got back to work. Okafor. She keyed the radio out of habit and got static and keyed it again. Dale? Nothing. She turned. He was flat against the rock 4 meters away and he wasn't moving. She stared at him for 2 seconds that felt like something longer, watching for chest rise. She saw it. Faint, irregular, and moved to him in a low crawl that kept her body behind the rock line. He was unconscious, breathing in the shallow way that meant either head injury or hypoxia or both. There was blood on the left side of his face from a fragment wound she couldn't accurately assess without moving him. And moving him on a 40-degree slope in the middle of an active engagement was something she was not going to do. She found his pulse. It was there. It was weak, but it was there. She keyed his radio, same static as hers. She looked back at the canyon. The ambush was still running. The machine guns on the ridges were still cycling, still working their interlocking fields of fire. But Reed's element had found something. She could see the pattern of their return fire changing. They'd identified at least 2 of the bunker positions and were putting sustained fire on them now, not ranging shots. Suppression. They were working towards something, but the wires were still there. The charges were still in the walls. And whoever was left inside that command bunker, if anyone was left, might still have the ability to send a trigger signal through a 3rd or 4th redundant system that she hadn't identified. She was alone on this ridge, 1,000 meters above a canyon full of people who were trying to stay alive. Her spotter was breathing but not conscious. Her primary radio was jammed. The counter-sniper was still up there somewhere, adjusting, waiting for her to show herself again. And the canyon walls were still loaded with enough explosive material to collapse onto nearly 100 people. She looked at the rifle in her hands. Then she looked down at the canyon. Then she looked at Dale Okafor's still face against the frozen rock. She picked up the rifle. She turned back toward the notch, and somewhere below, in the silence between bursts of fire, she heard a sound that shouldn't have been there. The slow, careful crunch of footsteps on frozen gravel, coming from above her position along the ridge. Not below. Above. The counter-sniper wasn't staying at range anymore. They were coming to finish this by hand. The footsteps were deliberate. Not the loose scramble of someone moving fast across frozen terrain. These were measured, patient. The kind of steps taken by someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't in any hurry because they believed the outcome was already decided. Each crunch of boot on frost-cracked gravel was separated by 3 or 4 seconds of silence, and in those silences Elena could hear the distant thunder of the canyon ambush rolling between the cliff walls below like something geological, like the mountain itself was grinding its teeth. She did not move. Moving was what he wanted. Movement produced heat signature, produced sound, produced the small disruptions in the environment, disturbed snow, shifted gravel, that a trained tracker used to confirm a position. She stayed flat in the notch and ran the math on what she knew. Counter-sniper, trained. Had her suppressed position within 2 shots, which meant either prior intelligence on Overwatch placement or significant field experience with how sniper pairs selected ground. Had held at range initially, standard doctrine, but was now closing. That meant one of 2 things. He'd lost visual on her position after she moved to the notch and was coming forward to reacquire. Or he'd assessed that the range engagement wasn't going to resolve cleanly and had decided to close the distance and end it. Either way, he was coming up the ridge and she was at the bottom of a notch with a rifle that was not designed for close quarters. She looked at Okafor. He hadn't moved. His chest was still rising and falling in that shallow, irregular rhythm that she didn't like but couldn't fix right now. She looked at the pistol on her thigh. Compact, suppressed, 15 rounds of subsonic hollow point. At close range inside a confined space, infinitely more manageable than the Chaytak. She left the rifle where it was, propped in the notch, pointed at the bunker because if she got a window she was going to use it, and drew the pistol with her right hand. The footsteps stopped. 30 seconds of silence. She controlled her breathing through her nose, slow and even, keeping her mouth closed because exhaled vapor was visible in this temperature, and visible meant locatable. Then gravel shifted. Close. Maybe 12 meters above and slightly west of her position, which told her he'd already worked around her original firing location and was coming down the ridge spine toward her. Smart. The ridge spine was solid rock, no loose material, nearly silent. She pressed tighter into the notch and waited. Bo? Below, the ambush was changing shape. She couldn't look, not without exposing herself, but she could read it through sound. The interlocking machine gun fire that had been cycling in disciplined 3 to 5 second bursts was becoming less synchronized. 2 of the guns had gone silent. Either Reed's element had found effective angles against the bunker apertures, or the crews inside had shifted to deal with something she couldn't see. The mortar fire had stopped completely, which was interesting. Mortars didn't stop because they ran out of ammunition, they stopped because the crew had a problem, or because the fire mission was complete, or because someone had put effective fire on the tube position. Reed's people were fighting back, and they were doing damage, but the wires were still in the canyon walls. She was certain of that. Nothing she'd done, not the antenna shot, not the bunker strike, had addressed the detonation circuit directly. She'd bought time, maybe minutes, maybe less. A shadow crossed the top of the notch. Not a bird, not cloud cover. She pressed her back against the rock and raised the pistol. The shadow moved east and then stopped. And then there was silence again that lasted long enough that she began to wonder if she'd misread the geometry of his approach. Then a single small rock fell into the notch from above, not thrown, dislodged accidentally, and she knew he was directly overhead, maybe 4 or 5 meters above her, on the edge of the rock formation that formed the notch's ceiling. He was looking for her. She could hear his breathing now, controlled, the breathing of someone who'd done this before. "I know you're in there," he said. Not loud, almost conversational. The voice was accented, Eastern European, she thought, or Russian adjacent, and completely calm in the way that men who operated in this specific register of violence were sometimes completely calm. Not bravado, not theater, just a statement of fact. She said nothing. "Your spotter is alive," he continued. "I could have taken him when I came around the east position. I didn't. I want you to know that." She kept the pistol raised and waited. "The men in the canyon are already finished," he said. "The trigger command went out 4 minutes ago. Secondary circuit. There's nothing left for you to protect." Her stomach tightened. She didn't let herself believe it, and she didn't let herself disbelieve it, because both were reactions, and reactions took resources she didn't have to spare right now. "If that were true," she said, keeping her voice flat and quiet, "you wouldn't still be up here talking to me." A pause. "No," he said. "Maybe not." Then he was moving again, east along the rock ceiling above the notch, and she tracked the sound and understood what he was doing. He was working toward the far end of the notch, where the rock formation had a gap wide enough to look down into her position. He was going to get eyes on her. She moved first. She came out of the notch low and fast, moving right, west, away from his direction of travel, and dropped into a depression in the rock she'd noted during her initial position survey. The depression was shallow, barely 30 centimeters, but it broke her outline against the sky and gave her a sight line back toward the top of the notch and the ridge line above it. He appeared at the far end of the notch and looked down and found it empty. She had maybe 2 seconds before he turned. She didn't take the shot. The pistol was suppressed but subsonic. At this range, approximately 18 meters, she had a high probability shot at his torso, but high probability was not certainty, and a wounded counter-sniper with a precision rifle at 18 meters was still very dangerous. More importantly, she needed to know about the trigger command, whether he was lying or whether the secondary circuit had actually fired. She stayed flat and watched him. He was big, taller than she'd expected from his movement pattern, broad through the shoulders, carrying a suppressed precision rifle on a single-point sling that he'd swung behind him while he moved. His face was obscured by a balaclava and ballistic glasses, and he moved on the ridge with the kind of unconscious competence that came from years of doing this in places where getting it wrong meant you didn't come home. He turned away from the notch and scanned the ridge. She pressed flatter. His scan moved across her depression and continued east. Not because he hadn't looked in the right direction, because her thermal suppression blanket, still draped across her back from when she'd moved out of the notch, was doing what it was designed to do. To a thermal optic, she would read as cold rock. He keyed a radio. She couldn't hear what he said, but she watched his posture during the transmission, and what she saw in those 5 or 6 seconds told her something important. He wasn't receiving confirmation. He was asking for something and not getting a clear answer. He keyed again. Waited. His body language shifted. Not dramatically, a professional controlling it, but she'd been watching people for long enough to read the small tells. The slight forward lean that meant he was straining to hear. The way his hand tightened briefly on the radio before releasing. Something in the command net was disrupted, which meant the trigger command hadn't gone out. Or it had gone out and something had interrupted the circuit. Or the command bunker was no longer functional enough to confirm execution. She filed that away and kept watching. He moved to the ridge crest and looked down into the canyon. She used those 30 seconds to get back to Okafor. He was still where she'd left him, and when she pressed 2 fingers to his neck, the pulse was there. Still weak, but possibly slightly stronger than before. She couldn't be sure. It might have been her own elevated heart rate distorting the comparison. She checked his pupils with a small light. Left pupil was sluggish. Right was normal. She didn't like the left pupil, but it wasn't blown, which ruled out the worst-case intracranial scenario. She leaned close to his ear. "Dale, I need you to squeeze my hand." Nothing for 3 seconds. Then his left hand tightened on her fingers. Slight, barely there. "Okay," she said. "You're okay. Stay still." She pulled back and looked at his radio. Tried it again on the emergency channel. The jamming was still there, but she listened more carefully. It was weaker than before. The flatline signal meter was now showing faint, intermittent movement. Something in the jamming apparatus had been degraded. Maybe her bunker shot. Maybe something Reed's team had done on the ground. Not enough to transmit, but the direction was right. She tried the satellite uplink on Okafor's unit, got the blocking tone, but the tone cut out for half a second before resuming. In that half second, she sent the standard emergency burst. 1 long tone, 3 short. And then the tone returned, and she couldn't tell if anything had gotten through. A sound from the ridge above made her look up. The counter-sniper was coming back down off the crest. He'd seen something in the canyon that had changed his plans. She positioned herself at the base of the notch again, pistol ready, and watched him descend. He moved quickly now, purpose replacing the careful patience of before, and she realized as he came down that he wasn't heading toward her position anymore. He was heading toward the northern end of the ridge, moving parallel to the canyon wall. He was going to another firing position. She followed him with the pistol and didn't fire because she still didn't know what he'd seen in the canyon that had changed his direction, and because a missed shot or a shot that didn't stop him immediately would tell him exactly where she was before she understood the tactical situation. She let him go and moved to the ridge crest herself. What she saw when she looked down into the canyon stopped her breath for a moment. Reed's element had broken out. Not fully, not cleanly, but a group of maybe 20 operators had found a drainage channel in the canyon's south wall, barely visible from above, probably invisible from the machine gun positions on the north ridge, and were moving through it in single file. The channel ran roughly west, which meant it was taking them away from the weapons complex, but also away from the kill zone. And away from the kill zone was the correct priority right now. The remaining operators on the canyon floor were providing covering fire, drawing the attention of the still active machine guns, buying time for the drainage channel group to move. It was a sacrifice play, and everyone involved knew it. She scanned for Reed, found him after a moment. She recognized his movement pattern, the way he ran hunched slightly right because of an old injury she'd been briefed on. He was with the covering force, not the drainage channel group. He'd sent his people out and stayed back. The counter-sniper had seen the drainage channel group. He was going to a position where he could fire down into that channel. She didn't think about it. She moved. The ridge between her position and the counter-sniper's new firing point was 40 meters of broken terrain, ice-covered flat rock, 2 sections of loose scree, a crevice that was maybe 60 centimeters wide and ran perpendicular to her path. She crossed it at a run that was more controlled falling than actual running, keeping her weight forward, choosing each foot placement in the fraction of a second before she committed to it. She crossed the scree sections without triggering a slide, but not quietly. The material shifted under her boots, and the sound was audible in the silences between gunfire below. He heard it. He spun from his new position. She saw him react, saw the rifle coming around, and she dropped behind the crevice edge as the round cracked past her, close enough that she felt the pressure differential against her left cheek. She went flat and pressed against the crevice wall, and there was a frozen moment where both of them were in cover and neither had a clean angle on the other. "You're faster than I expected," he said from behind his rock. She didn't answer. "The drainage channel," he said. "I'm going to clear it before those men get out. You understand that?" "You're going to try," she said. A short silence. "You're one person with a pistol. You know what I had before this pistol. Your Chaytak is back in the notch. At this range, a long gun is a liability." He wasn't wrong, which was precisely why she'd taken the pistol instead of going back for the rifle. "How many people have you done this with?" she asked. Keeping him talking, yes, but also genuinely trying to calibrate something about him. His confidence, his patience, whether he was the kind of person who talked because he liked to hear himself or because he'd learned that conversation sometimes created openings. "This?" A pause that might have been amusement. "Too many." "For who?" "Does it matter?" "Humor me." Another pause. Longer. "3 contractors. Before that, state service." "Which state?" He didn't answer that one. She used the silence to work her way along the crevice edge, moving east, changing her angle on his position by maybe 15 degrees. Not enough to shoot, enough to understand the geometry better. "You know what I think?" he said. "Tell me." "I think you're running the angles right now, trying to find a shot." His voice hadn't moved. He was staying still. "I've been doing this a long time. Every shooter does the same thing when they're cornered. They do math. They look for the equation that works, and then they get very quiet because they're committed to an approach." She stopped moving. "You stopped," he said. She started moving again, deliberately, making noise. "Now you're moving to convince me you didn't stop." A pause. "You're good. I want you to know that's not a compliment I give easily." "I'm not interested in your compliments." "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." Below, the gunfire shifted again. She heard something new, a different sound, heavier and more rhythmic, coming from the western end of the canyon. She couldn't identify it immediately, and then she could. Rotors. Aircraft rotors. At distance, barely audible over the ambient battle noise, but there. Someone had gotten a signal out. Maybe her burst transmission, maybe something Reed's signals element had managed on the ground. Either way, the sound was there and growing, and she saw the counter-sniper's rock shift, the micro-movement of someone adjusting their body in response to a new variable. He heard it too. "Your extraction," he said. "Maybe. Changes the timing." "Yes." She heard him take a breath. Then, "Tell me something. Was the ridge position your idea or your commander's?" The question was so disconnected from the immediate situation that it surprised her, and she paused before answering. "Mine." "The command element thought you were redundant." Not a question. She didn't know how he knew that, and she filed it for later. People usually do. And yet, here you are. Something shifted in his voice. Not softness. Men like this didn't do softness. Something more like professional acknowledgement. "I was told the Overwatch element was a formality. One shooter, standard placement, low threat role." "They told you wrong." "Yes," he said. "They did." The rotors were louder now. She risked a glance over the crevice edge. Nothing visible yet, but the sound was coming from a definite direction. Northwest, below the ridgeline, which meant the aircraft were flying the canyon approach at low altitude. Attack or transport, she couldn't tell yet. The counter-sniper made his decision. She heard him move. Not away from her, toward her, fast and low and using the sound of the approaching aircraft to cover the sound of his boots on the rock. He was closing the distance and he was doing it now while she was listening for aircraft and her attention was split. She pulled back from the crevice edge and dropped into a flat prone behind a section of broken stone. He came over the crevice and she fired twice. The first round caught him in the left shoulder. She saw his body absorb it. The impact visible even through his heavy gear, the slight rotation, the involuntary grunt that escaped before he locked it down. He went left with the impact rather than fighting it, which told her everything about his training. He'd been shot before, and he knew that fighting the physics was the wrong response. The rifle swung wide on its sling, and he transitioned to a sidearm in the same motion, pulling it with his right hand, and she fired the second round. It hit body armor. Center mass, ceramic plate, which she'd known was there and had tried to go high anyway, and hadn't been quite fast enough in the transition. The round staggered him without penetrating, and she was already moving, not back, forward, because backward was the wrong answer when someone had just transitioned to a pistol, and the distance between you was under 10 meters. She drove into him shoulder first. It wasn't elegant. It was controlled violence the way a car wreck is controlled. Two bodies and competing momentum, and they went down together on the frozen rock with the kind of impact that compressed every joint and drove the air out of her lungs. His pistol went wide. She felt it leave his hand. She tried to pin his right arm and got it for maybe 2 seconds before his left arm, the arm she'd shot, came around with the butt of the pistol that shouldn't have been in his left hand because she'd shot that shoulder. He'd retrieved his pistol with his non-dominant hand, wounded shoulder and all. The impact against the side of her head was bright and hard and scattered her vision. She rolled, gravel under her hands. She got upright, not fully, one knee down, and swung the pistol toward him and found his pistol already moving toward her. Both of them stopped, 10 feet apart. Both weapons up, both breathing hard. His left shoulder was dark with blood that was spreading down his sleeve faster than she would have liked if she were in his position. Her vision was still resolving from the pistol butt impact, a slow clearing like a windshield defrosting. "Here," he said. "Here," she agreed. The rotors were very loud now. She could see lights in the northwest sky, 2 aircraft, low and fast, and then she caught the silhouette against the pale overcast and recognized the profile. Vipers. Attack helicopters, not transport. Someone had scrambled close air support. He looked at the lights. She watched his face rather than the lights. "The canyon charges," she said. "Secondary circuit. Where is it?" His eyes came back to her. "You said the trigger command went out," she said. "You were asking for confirmation and not getting it. That means something in the circuit failed, but the charges are still in the walls." He was quiet. "Those are coalition soldiers down there," she said. "Special operations. They have families. Everyone has families. Tell me where the secondary detonator is." He looked at her for a long moment. The blood from his shoulder was dripping off his elbow now, steady drops on the frozen rock. The helicopter lights were sweeping the canyon below. She could hear radio transmissions she couldn't make out, the back and forth of the air element coordinating with whoever they'd re-established contact with on the ground. "The secondary is hardwired," he said. "It doesn't transmit. Someone has to be physically present to trigger it." "Where?" "East wall, bottom of the canyon. There's a maintenance access point, looks like a drainage cover. Orange marker spray covered with dirt. You won't find it from above." "How many people know where it is?" "2 now." He paused. "The man who placed it is dead." She looked at him. "Your second shot," he said. "Into the bunker. The eastern ventilation slot." A slight shift of expression that might have been grimness or might have been something else. "You didn't miss." She held the pistol steady and thought about what to do with the information she'd just been given and the man who'd given it to her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I was told this operation was clean," he said. "High-value weapon seizure, minimum collateral. The people in the canyon would be given opportunity to withdraw." He looked down at the canyon, at the lights moving through it, at the shapes of men still fighting in the darkness below. "This is not what I was told this operation was." She didn't say anything. "The charges in those walls were never part of the brief I accepted." His voice was flat, controlled, but something behind it was not. "I don't—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. "I don't do civilians. I don't do buried alive. That's not—" He stopped again. She waited. "That's not what I am," he said finally. She lowered the pistol. Not all the way. Halfway. He looked at her and then he slowly lowered his own weapon. Neither of them moved for a moment. The helicopter lights swept the canyon. The gunfire below was sporadic now, broken, the ambush's coordination disintegrating as the air support changed the tactical equation. "You need to get to the east wall," he said. "Drainage cover, orange marker. There's a manual lockout, a mechanical pin, not electronic. Pull the pin, the firing circuit breaks." "How do I know you're not sending me into a secondary ambush?" "You don't." She looked at him, looked at his shoulder. "You need a tourniquet," she said. "I'll manage. You'll bleed out on this ridge. That," he said, "is currently a secondary concern." He held her gaze. Go. She went. Getting off the ridge was its own problem. The route she'd used to ascend, a switchback goat path on the western face, was exposed to the North Ridge machine gun position, which as far as she knew was still active. She moved along the ridge crest to a point where the cliff face had a more forgiving grade, identified a descent route that kept her body below the skyline for most of the way down, and committed to it. The first 30 meters were technical, handhold to handhold on rock that was glazed with ice in the shaded sections, and she did it by feel as much as sight, her injured hand screaming every time she closed it on a grip. The fragment wounds she'd taken from the first counter-sniper shot were not deep, but they were in the specific place on the back of her left hand where every grip motion pulled the skin tight across the cuts, and by the time she reached the more gradual lower slope, her left glove was soaked through. She didn't stop. The canyon floor was chaos organized into pockets. She came in from the south slope, moving through the rubble field at the base of the cliff, and the first people she encountered were two operators from Reed's force who'd taken up a position behind a collapsed section of canyon wall. They tracked her with their weapons for the 2 seconds it took her to announce herself. Overwatch element, coming in? Cross. Don't shoot. One of them, she couldn't read his patch in the low light, kept his weapon on her an extra beat. You're the sniper? I'm the sniper. He lowered the weapon. The other one was working a field dressing on his left leg and didn't look up. Reed's been trying to raise you for 20 minutes. Jamming's partially down. I need to find the east wall. There's a secondary detonator at a drainage access point. The first operator stared at her. How do you know that? Long story. She looked east. Where's the east wall from here? He pointed. She went. The drainage cover was exactly where she'd been told it would be. She almost missed it anyway. The orange marker spray had faded to a rust stain under the layer of dirt that had been packed over it, and in the dark, with the canyon floor scattered with debris and shell casings, and the general visual noise of an active firefight, it looked like nothing. She found it by feel, running her hands along the base of the east wall at what she estimated was the right section, covering 6 meters of wall before her fingers found the edge of the metal panel. She pulled the dirt back, found the access handle, opened the panel. Inside was a simple junction box, not sophisticated, the kind of expedient construction done by people who knew what they needed to accomplish and didn't have time for elegance. A firing board with a single manual trigger mechanism wired to the detonation circuits on both walls, and beside the trigger, exactly where she'd been told, a mechanical safety pin on a short chain. She pulled it. The firing board's ready indicator, a small red light she hadn't even noticed until it went out, went dark. She sat back on her heels and looked at the dark indicator for a moment. Then she heard boots on the canyon floor approaching from the west, and a voice she recognized from the mission brief. Cross. She stood up. Colonel Marcus Reed was about 40 meters away, moving toward her with 4 operators. He was bleeding from somewhere on his right forearm. She could see the field dressing. And his helmet was gone, and he looked like a man who'd been living inside a nightmare for the past hour and had just started to see the exit sign. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the open panel, looked at the dark indicator, looked at her hand, which was still bleeding through the soaked glove. Reeves said you neutralized the command element, he said. Reeves was his signals sergeant. Both antenna arrays. Yes. And the secondary detonator. Just now. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, one of the operators was speaking quietly into a radio, and the helicopter lights were moving differently now. Slower, deliberate arcs that meant they'd transitioned from an assault run to a search pattern, looking for wounded, looking for anything they'd missed. Reed looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways she wasn't going to try to read right now. You were rated as Overwatch only, he said. The brief said your role was observation and communication, no engagement authority beyond self-defense. The brief was wrong about a lot of things, she said. He was quiet again. My spotter is on the North Ridge, she said. Head injury, possible concussion. He needs extraction. Reed turned to one of his operators and said 2 words. The man was on the radio immediately. Then Reed looked back at her, and the complicated expression was still there, and she understood something about it that she hadn't immediately. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the look of a man reassessing something, running back through a series of decisions with new information, understanding where those decisions had been wrong, and not quite knowing what to do with that understanding yet. "You flagged the ridges before insertion," he said. "Your contact report. It didn't get through." "No." His jaw tightened. "It didn't." A pause. "I had you on the manifest as secondary support element. Non-essential." She looked at him. "I know," he said. She didn't say anything. "How many did we lose?" one of the operators behind Reed asked quietly. Not to her, to Reed. Reed didn't answer right away. He was still looking at Elena. And the look on his face, in this cold canyon with the helicopter lights sweeping overhead and the smell of propellant and blood in the air, was the look of a man who had just understood the full weight of a word like non-essential. He turned to his operator. "Get a head count. Every element." "Yes, sir." Then he turned back to Elena, and before he could say whatever he was going to say, a burst of radio traffic cut through the air, garbled, broken by the residual jamming, but audible enough that she could make out the essential content. Not all of the enemy's command structure was down. The weapons complex, the primary objective that the entire operation had been designed to reach, had just gone active. The radio transmission lasted 11 seconds, broken by jamming residue, clipped at both ends, but the middle section came through clearly enough that Reed's signal sergeant didn't have to interpret it. The weapons complex, designation Ironhold, the underground facility that the entire operation had been built around, had initiated an internal lockdown sequence. Emergency protocols. The kind that got triggered when a facility commander decided the surface situation was unrecoverable and began transitioning to contingency operations. Elena knew what contingency operations meant for a chemical weapons complex. Destroy the evidence before anyone gets inside. "How long does the lockdown sequence run before it triggers the destruction protocol?" she asked. Reed looked at her. "How do you know there's a destruction protocol?" "There's always a destruction protocol." She looked at the signal sergeant. "What's the facility's ventilation configuration? Did the brief cover it?" The sergeant, a compact man named Flores who was working 3 radios simultaneously, glanced at Reed. Reed gave a short nod. "2 primary ventilation shafts," Flores said. "Northwest and southeast. Single mechanical intake on the east face. Here." He pulled a tablet from his vest and brought up the facility schematic, cracked screen and all. "Emergency venting runs through the southeast shaft. If they burn the chemical stores, the southeast shaft becomes the exhaust point." "Yes." "What's downwind of the southeast shaft?" Flores looked at the schematic. Then he looked up. "The drainage channel." Reed said something under his breath that wasn't a word. He turned to his element leaders. "Get the drainage channel group back, right now. Full reversal, get them out of that channel." One of the operators was already running. Elena looked at the schematic. The facility entrance was 400 meters east along the canyon floor. She could see the hardened blast doors from here, or at least she could see where they were supposed to be, which was behind a false rock face that the satellite imagery had partially resolved, but not fully. 2 security bunkers flanked the entrance, both apparently abandoned now based on the absence of fire from that direction. But apparently and actually were different things in this canyon. "How many people do you have combat effective?" she asked Reed. 31. His voice was flat. "Out of 46 who entered the primary assault corridor." She did the arithmetic on what that meant and kept it off her face. "The lockdown sequence," she said. "How long?" Reed looked at Flores. "Standard military-grade protocol runs 20 minutes, Flores said. "But this facility is non-standard. Could be 15, could be 10. "When did the transmission cut?" Flores checked his watch. 4 minutes, 20 seconds ago. Reed looked at Elena. She looked back at him. "We can't breach a hardened facility with 31 personnel in under 6 minutes, he said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an excuse. It was a commander doing the math out loud, which was something she respected even when the math came up wrong. "You don't need to breach it," she said. "Cross, the ventilation system, southeast shaft. If someone gets to the mechanical intake on the east face and shuts the intake damper, it breaks the exhaust circuit. Emergency venting can't route through a closed damper. The destruction protocol stalls. The east face is exposed. We have at least one active position on the south ridge." "I know." "And you just came off that ridge." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the canyon was a different place than it had been 20 minutes ago. The helicopter gunships had suppressed the north ridge positions. Two of the four surviving machine gun bunkers were burning, and Reed's element was consolidating, pulling wounded into covered positions, reorganizing with the efficient grimness of people who'd been trained for exactly this contingency and still hated it every time. But there was a particular kind of quiet that had settled over the east end of the canyon near the blast doors that Elena didn't trust. "I'm going with you," Reed said. "You're the element commander." "Reyes has the element." He was already moving, pulling his rifle tight and checking the chamber. "And I'm not sending you in there alone." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and decided not to. "Your arm," she said. "It bends." "That's not what I asked." "It works," he said. "Let's go." Deck. They moved along the South Canyon wall, using the rock face as cover, staying low and keeping intervals. Reed was behind her with two operators, a woman named Sergeant Diaz, who moved like she was part of the rock, and a big quiet man called Torque, who hadn't said a single word since Elena had come down off the ridge, and didn't seem to feel the need to start. The east end of the canyon was wrong in ways she was still cataloging. Too quiet. The blast doors ahead of them, now visible as the false rock face transitioned to actual hardened steel at about 200 meters, showed no movement. No personnel on the approaches. The flanking bunkers were dark. Everything about it said abandoned, which was exactly what a facility that had gone into internal lockdown would look like, but also exactly what a facility that was preparing an ambush would look like. And the two were not mutually exclusive. She slowed at a section of fallen rock and Reed came up beside her. "South Ridge," she said quietly. 11 o'clock. "There's a firing position up there that was active before. I can't confirm it's clear." Reed looked. "I don't see movement." "Neither do I." He understood what she meant. "Diaz, Torque, hold here. Watch the South Ridge. Anything moves up there, you suppress immediately and keep suppressing." "Roger," Diaz said. She and Reed moved forward alone. The east face of the facility was around a natural jog in the canyon wall, partially screened from the main canyon floor. The mechanical intake was marked on Flores's schematic as a gray panel, roughly 1 meter square, set into the canyon wall at ground level. She found it in under 30 seconds because she'd memorized the schematic's reference measurements against known features. She also found something else. The panel was open. Not damaged, not blown. Open, deliberately, the way a panel gets opened when someone takes a key to it. She stopped. Reed came up beside her and saw it and didn't say anything. The damper inside the intake assembly was visible. A flat metal plate controlled by a hand-operated screw mechanism currently in the full open position. Someone had opened it recently. The metal around the mechanism showed fresh scratches in the frost coating, the kind left by hasty tool use within the last hour. "Someone opened it," Reed said. "After the lockdown started," she said. "Look at the frost pattern. These scratches are fresh." Meaning the lockdown automatically closed the damper as part of the safety protocol, and someone came out here and manually reopened it. Meaning someone inside wants the exhaust circuit to work. The silence between them was about 2 seconds. "The destruction protocol isn't a contingency," Reed said slowly. "It's the objective." She looked at him. He was already there. "Someone inside that facility wants the chemical stores destroyed," she said. "Not to deny us the weapons, to release them." She looked at the open damper. The southeast shaft doesn't just exhaust downward. Wind direction in this canyon runs northeast. The drainage channel group, anyone in the eastern approach corridor, the canyon population, Reed said, our people, and anything downwind of this position for the next several kilometers. Reed keyed his radio. "Flores, what's the wind speed and direction at canyon floor level east end?" A pause. "Northeast, sir. 8 to 12 knots. Gusting." He and Elena looked at each other. She reached for the damper mechanism. The shot came from above. It hit the rock face 6 inches from her hand, and the fragment spray cut across her knuckles. Same left hand, same cuts. And the pain was sharp and immediate, and she pulled back on instinct before she could stop herself. She pressed against the wall and looked up. South Ridge, there it was. The muzzle blast she hadn't seen before because the position was occupied now when it hadn't been 30 seconds ago. Someone had moved into it in the time she and Reed had been at the panel. Reed was flat against the wall on the other side of the panel, and he put 2 fast shots up at the ridge position that were suppressive rather than accurate. The angle was bad, the position was partly defilated behind a rock formation, And at this range with a carbine, he wasn't going to hit anything he aimed at, but he was telling the shooter to keep their head down. The shooter kept their head up. Another round hit this canyon wall above the panel. These were precision shots, not spray. Someone up there with a designated marksman rifle working a position they'd prepared, not improvised. The damper mechanism was exposed. Anyone who reached for it was going to get hit. Options, Reed said. She looked at the panel. The damper screw was a standard quarter-turn mechanism. She could close it in under 3 seconds if she could get her hand on it without getting it shot off. The range to the ridge position was approximately 240 meters. The angle from the firing position to the panel was steep, which would require the shooter to either hang their weapon over the rock edge or lean out significantly, both of which compromised their stability, which was why they were hitting rock near the panel rather than the panel itself. The shot that had cut her hand had been close, but not on target. Good shooter working a difficult angle, not a perfect shooter working an easy one. She looked at Reed's rifle. Give me a mark on that position. Sustained. Don't stop until I tell you. I can't hit it from here. I know, I need them thinking about incoming, not about angle correction. He looked at her. What are you going to do? Close the damper. They'll shoot you. They'll try. She looked at her left hand. The new cuts overlaid the old fragment wounds, and the whole thing was a mess, but the hand worked. She'd confirmed that twice in the last hour. Mark on my count. He put his back against the wall, angled his rifle up toward the ridge position, and looked at her. 3, she said. 2, 1. Mark. He opened up. Fast, controlled pairs, not full auto, because full auto was for suppression at shorter ranges, but rhythmic enough that it would demand a response from the shooter above. The human instinct to duck when rounds were cracking overhead was something that training could modify but not eliminate. She stepped out from the wall and reached for the damper. The round came. She heard it arrive before she felt it, the sharp crack of supersonic passage, and it went past her right shoulder close enough that she felt disturbed air against her neck, and her hand was already on the mechanism, and she turned it. 1/4 turn. The damper plate rotated shut with a solid mechanical clunk that she felt through her palm. She was back against the wall before the shooter could correct. Reed stopped firing. Both of them were breathing hard. Done? He asked. She looked at her hand. Her knuckles were bleeding again from where she'd hit them on the mechanism in the haste. Done. He stared at her for a moment, then looked away, which was the particular reaction of someone who'd just watched something that recalibrated their sense of what was possible and didn't have the bandwidth right now to fully process it. We need to get people back, she said. Everyone east of the midpoint. The facility still has the chemical stores. Even with the exhaust circuit broken, we don't know what their next move is. He was already on the radio. Flores, get me Reyes, all elements west of marker Bravo, right now. They moved. The next 18 minutes were the longest Elena could remember, since a situation in a place she was not allowed to name, 2 years and 4 months ago, that had ended in ways she still didn't fully know how to organize in her head. She stayed with Reed's element as they consolidated at the western end of the canyon, using the fallen rock formations as a command post that was ugly and cramped and served its purpose. The helicopter gunships were working the remaining ridge positions methodically, and the sound of 20-millimeter cannon fire echoed between the cliffs with a regularity that was almost comforting, each burst representing a bunker aperture that was no longer able to put rounds on the canyon floor. The head count came back in increments. 31 combat effective, 12 wounded but mobile, 8 wounded and requiring assisted movement. 7 KIA. 7. Reed received the number from Reyes and stood with it for a moment without moving, and Elena looked away because that moment was not hers to witness. The facility's blast doors were still closed. The lockdown sequence had passed its original estimated completion window. Flores had updated his estimate twice, finally landing on the assessment that the manual damper closure had either stalled the protocol entirely or triggered a secondary decision cycle inside the facility, which meant someone in there was adapting. We can't wait them out indefinitely, Reed said. He'd been staring at the blast doors through a spotting scope for 3 minutes. If they have another exhaust route, or if they find the damper and reopen it, we're back to the same problem. The facility commander is making a decision right now, Elena said. The destruction protocol stalled. Their surface security is gone. They have coalition air assets overhead and a ground force that didn't die the way they planned. They're going to do one of 3 things. Surrender, destroy and escape through a secondary exit, or initiate a partial release through the primary ventilation and take their chances with the wind. Yes? In that order of likelihood? In reverse order of likelihood, she said. He looked at her. You're saying they'll go for partial release first. They didn't go to all this trouble to give up the weapon. The ambush, the cliff charges, the sabotage damper, this wasn't a defensive operation. Someone planned a demonstration. The coalition force was always supposed to die in this canyon, and the chemical release was always supposed to happen. We disrupted the timeline, not the intention. He was quiet for a moment. That's an intelligence assessment, not a tactical one. Yes. Where does it come from? She looked at the blast doors. 11 hours of watching this canyon before your column arrived. The pre-placed charges weren't improvised. The jamming array wasn't improvised. The counter-sniper element wasn't improvised. This was planned months in advance, probably more, by someone who anticipated a coalition response and designed the entire operation around converting that response into a mass casualty event. She could feel him looking at her. The brief said low-level security contractors, he said. The brief was built from 48-hour-old imagery and didn't include thermal analysis of the ridge positions. She kept her voice neutral. I flagged that. Your contact report. Yes. He was quiet again, longer this time. I read your file before this mission, he said, before insertion. I read the classification summary. She waited. It said you were a Tier 2 asset, he said. Overwatch specialist, limited engagement authorization, previous work in passive reconnaissance roles. He paused. It didn't say anything about what I've watched you do in the last 2 hours. She looked at him. Files get written by people who weren't there. Where were you before this? She turned back toward the blast doors. The parts that are relevant are in the file. He let it go, because a man like Reed understood there were questions you didn't push, and classifications that existed for reasons even commanders didn't need. Then Flores's radio went to life with a tone that cut through everything. Active venting, Flores said. His voice had gone flat in the way trained people's voices went flat when they were managing something they weren't supposed to let you see in their face. Northwest shaft, they've switched to the northwest shaft. Not the southeast. The northwest. Elena looked at the canyon layout in her head. The northwest shaft exited on the upper face of the facility, which opened toward. She ran the wind direction, northeast at 8 to 12 knots. She ran the geometry. What's northwest of this canyon? She asked sharply. Populated area, settlement, anything? Flores was already on it. He had a mapping tablet up and was zooming before she finished the sentence. His face went through something, and then he controlled it. There's a village, he said. 14 kilometers. Small. Maybe 300 people. 14 kilometers. At 8 to 12 knots, northeast wind, a chemical dispersal agent from the northwest shaft would reach the first structures of that village, and she was already doing the math, and she didn't want to finish it. How long has the northwest shaft been venting? Reed asked Flores. The tone triggered 40 seconds ago. Can we close the northwest shaft from outside? Negative. Northwest shaft access is internal only. Reed looked at Elena. She saw in his face the specific look of a commander who had run out of options he'd been trained for and was looking at someone who might have one he hadn't thought of. The blast doors, she said. They're hardened. We don't have the demolition package to. I don't need to breach the doors. I need to get in. There's a manual override panel on the right door, personnel access. It requires an electronic key fob and a 6-digit code. She watched his face. The facility commander used a key fob. Every facility commander does. The facility commander is inside. The counter-sniper on the South Ridge wasn't inside. He was a contracted external element. He had communications with the command structure. She looked at Reed. He told me where the secondary detonator was. He told me the triggerman was the person killed by my second bunker shot. Reed stared at her. You talked to him? On the ridge, yes. The man who was trying to kill you? Also, yes. And you're saying he might have a key fob. I'm saying an external contractor at his operational level with direct access to the facility command net is the kind of asset that gets provisioned with access credentials in case the primary command element becomes non-functional. Reed was already looking toward the ridge. He's still up there? He was alive when I left him, bleeding from a shoulder wound. He'd been up there for days, probably had a supply cache. She paused. He's a professional. He's not going to bleed out from a shoulder wound if he has any supplies. The northwest shaft had been venting for 90 seconds. Flores, Reed said, get me a wind model. Time to dispersal at 14 clicks, northeast, current conditions. Flores worked for 10 seconds that felt much longer. 11 minutes to threshold concentration at village perimeter, assuming standard agent density. 11 minutes. Reed looked at Elena and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She was already looking at the South Ridge. The South Ridge was a different climb than the North Ridge she'd ascended in the dark before insertion. Shorter and steeper, the access route less a path than a series of problems to be solved with handholds and core strength and the specific stubbornness that comes from having no alternative. Reed had offered to come with her, and she'd told him no, because one person moved faster than two on technical terrain, and she didn't have time to manage anyone else's footing. She went up. Her left hand was a problem, not a fatal one. The cuts were sealing in the cold, which was one of the few advantages of working in sub-zero environments. But every grip that required full finger extension pulled the wounds open, and the warm, wet sensation against her palm was a distraction she had to consciously set aside each time it appeared. She set it aside 8 times on the way up. The South Ridge firing position was where she'd expected it, a natural alcove in the rock face that offered excellent coverage of the East Canyon floor, the kind of position a trained eye would select within minutes of walking this terrain. She found the counter-sniper because she heard him before she saw him. Not movement, breathing. The controlled, deliberate breathing of someone managing pain with the same discipline they'd apply to any other tactical problem. He was sitting with his back against the alcove wall, his left arm immobilized against his body with what appeared to be a length of cordage taken from his kit. The shoulder wound field-dressed with competence, if not elegance. He had his sidearm in his right hand. It was pointed at her before she cleared the final rock. She stopped. He looked at her. After a moment, he lowered the pistol. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." The canyon charges. Neutralized. He nodded, a small movement that she thought cost him something. The facility is venting. Northwest shaft. 11 minutes to a village 14 kilometers northeast. She held his gaze. "I need the key fob." He was quiet. "The personnel access override on the blast doors," she said. "You have one. An asset at your level with command net access gets provisioned with, I know what you're asking." His voice was rough but controlled. "I know what it's for." She waited. He reached into his chest rig with his right hand, his shoulder wound making the motion deliberate and clearly painful, and withdrew a flat electronic fob attached to a short lanyard. He held it out. She crossed the alcove and took it. 6-digit code, she said. He told her. 6 digits, spoken once, clearly. She committed them to memory the way she committed ballistic data. Immediate, permanent, unambiguous. "Why did you open the damper?" she asked. The question had been sitting in her since she'd found the open panel. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't." She looked at him. "I came down from this position 40 minutes ago," he said, "to close it. The facility commander sent a team out to open it during the lockdown initiation. I was supposed to make sure it stayed open." He paused. "I closed it instead." The implication landed in full. He'd been working against the operation from the inside, at least partially, at least from the point where the scope of what was actually planned had become clear to him. "You closed it and then came back up here," she said. "Yes." "And then kept shooting at me." "Yes." A pause that might, in different circumstances, have been uncomfortable. "You were trying to close it again." "I didn't know you'd already done it." She stood there with the key fob in her hand and looked at him. "There are people in that facility," he said. "Technical staff. Some of them didn't know what this operation actually was. They were told weapons disposal, decommissioning." He held her gaze. "I don't know how many, but they're not combatants." She nodded once. She turned to go. "Cross?" he said. She stopped. "The facility commander. His name is Varric. He'll be in the command center, lowest level, northwest corner. He won't come out and he won't stop." She looked back at him. "He's the one who planned all of this," he said. "The ambush, the charges, the village. His voice was flat in the way that contained something harder than flatness. He showed me the operational map 2 days ago. He was proud of it. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she went back down the ridge faster than she'd come up. The key fob worked on the first attempt. The personnel access panel accepted the code without hesitation, and the heavy steel door section swung inward on pneumatic hinges that were military-grade and completely silent, which was the detail that told her the facility was maintained to a higher standard than anything in the brief had suggested. Reed was at her shoulder. She'd met him at the base of the ridge and covered the 400 meters to the blast doors in under 3 minutes. His 2 operators, Diaz and Torque, stacked on either side of the entrance. The northwest shaft had been venting for 6 minutes and 40 seconds when the door opened. 4 minutes. Maybe less. The interior was lit by emergency lighting, red-tinted strips along the floor and ceiling that cast everything in the particular palette of something going badly wrong. The air tasted like recycled oxygen and something else, something industrial and faintly metallic, that she identified after 3 seconds as a chemical scrubber operating at capacity. Someone had activated the facility's internal protection systems, which was standard during a venting event and also meant that whoever was inside had some intention of surviving the process. The entrance corridor ran straight for 20 meters and then bent right. She went first. Reed didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing about things she did operationally around the 3rd time he'd seen the results, which in a 2-hour operational window was faster calibration than most commanders managed in a full deployment. The corridor was empty. The bend opened into a junction, 3 directions, each lit by the same red emergency strips, each identified by a signage plate in a language she partially read and partially interpreted from the schematic she'd memorized. She went left, which was east, which was wrong for the command center, but right for the stairwell that would take her down to the lowest level without crossing the main facility floor. Torque found the first technical staff member in the stairwell. A young man, late 20s, crouched on a landing between levels with his hands over his ears and his eyes closed, wearing a lab coat over cold weather gear. He wasn't armed. He wasn't moving. He looked up at Torque with an expression that required no translation. Diaz pulled him up and started moving him toward the exit. Elena went down. The lowest level was colder than the upper floors. The facility's thermal management was failing as systems lost power in the lockdown sequence, and the cold of the mountain was seeping in through the rock. The command center was in the northwest corner, behind a door that was a different weight and material than everything else on the level, heavier, sealed, with a separate power supply running a status light above the frame. The status light was green, active, occupied. She looked at Reed. He looked at the door. "There's no override panel," he said quietly. "There's a hinge side," she said, "and the power to the magnetic lock is running off the facility's backup system." She looked at the ceiling, which is sharing load with the northwest shaft exhaust fans, the internal scrubbers, and the emergency lighting. Reed was already ahead of her. "If we cut the backup power, Shiki, the magnetic lock releases, the shaft fans stop, the emergency lighting goes out. We'd be in the dark." "Yes." She pulled her flashlight. For about 6 seconds before the tertiary battery system kicks in and restores partial power. 6 seconds is enough for the lock. He looked at her. At the flashlight. At the door. "Where's the backup power junction?" he said. "Northwest corner, upper level, same side as this room, directly above." He turned to Torque, who'd come back down after handing off the technical staff member to Diaz. "Torque, upper level, northwest corner. There's a power junction. I need it interrupted." Torque looked at the door, looked at the ceiling, and nodded once. He went up the stairs without a word. Elena positioned herself at the door. Reed took the opposite side. They waited. 12 seconds. The facility went dark. She hit the door in the same moment. Shoulder into the frame, the magnetic lock disengaged as promised, the door swinging inward into a room that her flashlight swept in a single motion. Varric was at the console in the northwest corner. He was not young. Not the profile she'd built in her head during the descent. Some hardened operational type. A military man who'd crossed lines gradually. He was perhaps 60, compact, with the kind of face that had lived inside institutions for so long it had started to resemble one. His hands were on a keyboard, and he'd been in the process of entering something when the power cut, and the screen in front of him was dark, And he was looking at her with an expression that was complex and specific. Not fear, not defiance. Something more like a man who has run an extremely detailed plan and is now observing the single variable he failed to account for. She crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled his hands off the keyboard. He didn't resist. "The northwest shaft," she said. "Close it. The power is the manual lever, right side of the console. I can see it from here." His eyes moved to the lever, then back to her. "The village is 14 kilometers," she said. "There are 300 people there. The wind projection shows dispersal below threshold concentration at 11 kilometers," he said. It came out like a briefing point, like he'd prepared it. "The village is outside the primary effect zone." She looked at him. "You ran models," she said. "Extensive ones." His voice was steady, analytical. The voice of someone who had organized something monstrous into the language of operations research and was genuinely unable to see the distance between those two things. "Pull the lever," she said. "The demonstration requires—" Reed put his hand on Varric's shoulder from behind, and the sentence stopped. Not because of force. Reed had barely touched him. Because the sentence had come to the end of the track it was on and couldn't find more. Varric looked at the lever. 3 minutes, 40 seconds of venting. He pulled it. The facility shuddered. Not dramatically. A mechanical thrum through the walls and floor as the exhaust fans reversed direction, pulling the vented material back into the facility's containment system. Not a solution, not a safe outcome for whatever had been released into the northwest shaft during those 3 minutes and 40 seconds. But a stop. A break in the circuit. The emergency lighting came back on. Tertiary power. Partial. The red strips at half brightness. Reed looked at Elena. She looked at the lever to confirm it was fully pulled. She looked at the console to confirm the shaft status indicators showed closed. Then she stepped back and became aware, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, of how much of her body hurt. Her left hand was bad. Her shoulder, where she'd fallen on the ridge during the close quarters encounter, had stiffened into the specific wrongness of a joint that had been impacted hard and was now informing her of its opinion of the experience. The fragment cuts on her neck and hands had clotted in the cold, but the clots were thin and she could feel them with every movement that stretched the skin. She stood in the red-lit command center with Varric sitting in front of her and Reed behind her, and the lever was pulled, and the shaft was closed, and somewhere above them the northwest shaft was sealed, and the village 14 kilometers away was still there. Reed called it up to Flores, got confirmation on the shaft closure, got confirmation that the wind dispersal model showed the released quantity, 3 minutes and 40 seconds of venting at assessed flow rate, had not reached threshold concentration before the shaft closed. The village was clear. Flores' voice on the radio was the most controlled she'd heard it since she'd met him, which was its own kind of testimony. Reed lowered the radio and looked at Varric, who was sitting with his hands in his lap and his face arranged into something that looked impossibly like the calm of a man who had completed a task. Not this task. The task he'd set out to complete. The thing he'd built in his head that was now gone. He was sitting with the absence of it, and he'd found some equilibrium in there that she found deeply uncomfortable to look at. She turned away from him and walked to the door. "Cross," Reed said. She stopped. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she could see him working through something, the kind of internal accounting that took real time, even in people who were used to making fast decisions. "The village," he said. "If you hadn't come back for that fob—" "I had the fob," she said. "We had time." "Barely." "Barely counts." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "The classification on your file. The parts that aren't in it." He held her gaze. "Someone made decisions about how to document you, what to include, what to call you." She waited. "Someone was wrong," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Outside the command center, she could hear Torque moving through the corridor and Diaz's voice from upper level and the distant, diminishing sound of helicopter rotors as the gunships completed their final sweep of the ridge positions. "Yes," she said. "They were." She walked out into the corridor. The corridor outside the command center smelled like cold concrete and fear sweat, and the particular chemical undertone of a scrubber system working past its designed parameters. Elena walked it without looking back. Behind her, she could hear Reed issuing instructions to Torque. "Secure the prisoner, document the console. Don't touch anything on the firing board." professional, methodical, the voice of a commander who had found his footing again. She was glad for that. A commander who'd lost his footing was a problem she didn't have energy for right now. She went up the stairs. The upper level was brighter. The tertiary power had stabilized and the emergency strips were holding at something closer to normal. Diaz had gathered 6 technical staff members in the main corridor near the entrance, all of them sitting against the wall with their hands visible, none of them appearing to present a threat. 2 were women. One looked barely old enough to have finished university. They all had the stunned, compressed expressions of people who had been told they were going to a decommissioning project and had spent the last hour listening to a battle happen above their heads. Elena stopped at the personnel door and looked back at Diaz. "Any more inside?" "Cleared 2 more sub-levels," Diaz said. "These are all of them. Facility was running a skeleton crew, 12 total, including the commander." 12. She looked at the technical staff. "Any of them give you trouble?" "No." Diaz paused. "The older one, the one in the blue jacket, he kept asking if the village was okay. Kept asking that. Didn't ask about himself." Elena looked at the man in the blue jacket. He was maybe 50, with the soft hands of someone who'd spent his career in laboratories rather than fields. He was looking at her with the particular desperation of someone waiting for a specific word. "The village is clear," she said. He closed his eyes. His shoulders came down about 2 inches. She went outside. The canyon was a different place than it had been 2 hours ago. The machine gun bunkers on the north ridge were dark. The helicopter gunships had completed their sweep, and one was holding a loose orbit above the ridgeline, while the other had set down on a flat section of canyon floor that had been hastily cleared of debris by Reed's remaining operators. Medevac was in progress. She could see the organized movement of stretchers, the quick, economical work of flight medics who knew they were on a timeline. She found Okafor on one of the stretchers. He was conscious. Not fully. His eyes were open but tracking slowly, and when she crouched beside him and said his name, he turned toward the sound rather than toward her face, which told her the head injury was still working on him. But his color was better than it had been on the ridge, and his pulse, when she checked it, was stronger and more regular. "Cross," he said. Her name came out slightly wrong, like a word in a language he was still remembering. "I'm here. What happened to this canyon?" "It's over. We're getting you out." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes found her face and settled there. "You went down." "Yes?" "I told you not to." "You were unconscious." He processed this. "That's not the same as not telling you." Despite everything, she felt something shift in her chest. Not quite a laugh. The precursor to one. "No, it's not." He closed his eyes. "The charges." "Handled." "The facility." "Handled." A long pause. "You're bleeding." "I know." "A lot." "I know, Dale." The flight medic appeared at her shoulder, young, efficient, the practiced impatience of someone who needed to load and go. She moved back and let him work, and she stood there watching Okafor get prepped for transport, and she didn't let herself think too hard about the hours she'd spent, not knowing whether the shallow breathing on that ridge was going to keep going or stop. She didn't let herself think about it because there was still work to do, and the work was the container that kept everything else in its correct compartment. And she had learned a long time ago that the compartments needed to stay closed until you were somewhere that opening them didn't cost you anything you needed. Reed found her as the medevac helicopter lifted. "There's a debrief aircraft inbound," he said. "Coalition intelligence. They'll be on the ground in 40 minutes. "Who's running it?" He told her. The name meant something to her, and she kept that off her face, which required a small, specific effort. "They'll want to talk to you first," he said. "I know." He studied her. "You know the lead debriefer?" "We've met." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He nodded and looked away toward the facility entrance where Torque was bringing Varric out into the canyon in flex cuffs, moving him with the firm, impersonal grip of someone transporting a package. Varric walked without resistance. He looked at the canyon around him, the dark bunkers, the rubble, the marks of the battle on the stone, and his face was doing something she couldn't fully read. Not remorse, not quite. More like a man taking inventory of a project that hadn't gone the way the plan specified, trying to understand which variable had caused the deviation. He looked at Elena as Torque walked him past. She looked back. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed on her for 4 or 5 steps, and in that time she understood that she was the variable. She was the thing that wasn't in his plans. Not Overwatch element, not secondary support asset, not non-essential, just the variable he hadn't accounted for. She held his gaze until he looked away. The debrief aircraft was a converted transport, mid-size, with a pressurized rear compartment that had been fitted out as a mobile operations center. It landed on the flat section of canyon floor 43 minutes after Reed told her it was coming, and the first person off the ramp was not an intelligence officer. It was Brigadier General Lana Marsh. Marsh was 61 years old and did not look it, not because she'd avoided age, but because her face had arrived at the kind of severity that made estimating it feel beside the point. She was the Senior Intelligence Coordinator for the Coalition's Special Operations Oversight Directorate, a position whose actual scope of authority was substantially broader than its title suggested. Elena had worked under Marsh's directorate for 4 years and had met her in person twice, once at a classified transition briefing and once in a hospital corridor in a city she was not going to name. Marsh came down the ramp and looked at the canyon, and then she looked at Elena, and her expression did not change because Marsh's expressions were managed resources that she allocated with the deliberateness of someone who had learned a long time ago that faces were information. Reed was at Elena's shoulder. "General," he said. "Colonel?" Marsh looked at him briefly and then back at Elena. "How bad is your hand?" Elena looked down. The left hand was bandaged now, field-dressed by one of Reed's medics, but blood had seeped through the gauze in 2 places. "Functional?" "That's not what I asked." "It'll hold until I can get it looked at properly." Marsh nodded once. She looked at Reed. "I need 10 minutes with Sergeant Cross." Something moved across Reed's face. Not objection. He wasn't going to object to a brigadier general, but something more like the instinct of a man who had spent the last 2 hours reconsidering how the people around him had been categorized and wasn't entirely comfortable with another categorization happening outside his presence. "She's been on this ridge since 0300, he said. "That's over 14 hours. "I'm aware of her timeline," Marsh said. 10 minutes, Colonel." He looked at Elena. She gave him a small nod that she meant as "it's fine." He walked away with the particular control of a man who disagrees and is choosing to process that privately. Marsh watched him go. "He's recalibrating." "Yes." "That's going to create complications." "Probably." Marsh turned to her fully. "Walk with me." They walked east toward the facility entrance, away from the main cluster of Reed's element and the intelligence personnel coming off the transport. The canyon walls caught the sound and held it, their footsteps on gravel, the distant idling of the helicopter, Reed's voice giving instructions somewhere behind them. "The mission brief rated this as a Tier 3 facility," Elena said. "The jamming array alone was Tier 1 infrastructure. The counter-sniper element was professional contract personnel, not facility security. The cliff charges were pre-placed weeks in advance, minimum. Someone built this brief badly." "Or someone built it specifically," Marsh said. Elena stopped walking. Marsh stopped beside her. She was looking at the facility entrance, not at Elena. The intelligence package for this operation passed through 4 separate clearance levels before it reached Colonel Reed's mission planning cell. At each level, assessments were modified, downgraded. The ridge thermal analysis that your request flagged was removed from the final product at the 3rd level. Removed, actively, not omitted. Removed, with a notation that it was superseded by more recent imagery. She paused. The more recent imagery was fabricated. The canyon air was very cold and very still. "Someone inside the clearance chain wanted this mission to go the way it nearly went," Elena said. "Yes." "And wanted the intelligence that might have prevented it to not be in the room." "Yes." She thought about the counter-sniper on the ridge, telling her the operation wasn't what he'd been told. Thought about Varric and his wind dispersal models and his calm, institutional face. Thought about the gap between what a mission brief says and what a canyon full of dead and wounded men says, and the person or people who sat in that gap and had decided it was an acceptable place to be. "You knew before this mission," Elena said. "Not an accusation, a calibration." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I had indicators, not confirmation." You sent us in anyway. The operation couldn't be canceled without alerting the person at the third clearance level that we'd identified the modification. If they'd known we were onto the fabrication, we'd have lost them. She paused. We needed the operation to proceed far enough to generate evidence. 7 people are dead. Yes. Marsh's voice didn't change. They are. And the Overwatch element. 1 person, rated non-essential, limited engagement authorization. Elena looked at her. That was yours. Marsh looked at her now, direct. Your classification was protective. If the person running the intelligence modification knew your actual background, your placement on this operation as Overwatch would have been a flag. A highly capable asset doesn't get assigned to a non-essential role. That would have told them we suspected the brief. So I was cover. You were protection, Marsh said. For the operation, for the operators, and for you. Your real file, in the wrong hands. My real file, Elena said, describes someone who could have changed the casualty count if they'd had proper positioning and engagement authority from the beginning. The silence between them was long enough to be a specific kind of answer. How many do we lose? Marsh asked. In the realistic alternative, where your file is accurate and your role is commensurate, and the person at the third clearance level sees that and cancels the fabrication and disappears, and we never identify them, and the next operation they compromise doesn't have you on it at all. Elena said nothing. I made a calculation, Marsh said. I'm not asking you to agree with it. Good, Elena said, because I don't. Marsh nodded, as if she'd expected exactly that, and it had confirmed something rather than troubled it. The person at the third clearance level, Elena said. Varric. Was he the source or the instrument? Instrument, we believe. The source is still unconfirmed. He had detailed knowledge of the Coalition's operational tempo, the timing of this mission, the composition of Reed's element, the insertion route. That's not contractor-level intelligence. No, that's directorate-level access. Yes. Elena looked at her. How high? Marsh looked back, and for the first time since she'd come off the aircraft ramp, her managed expression shifted. Not dramatically, a small movement around the eyes that contained something like the weight of a thing that had been carried for a while. High enough that this conversation is the beginning of something considerably more complicated than what happened in this canyon today, she said. Reed found Elena 20 minutes later, sitting on a flat section of rock near the canyon's western entrance. She'd been there since the conversation with Marsh ended, not doing anything in particular, which was unusual enough in the context of the day that she was mildly aware of it. He sat down 2 feet away. Not close. Gave her the space that people give someone they're not certain of yet. Intel wants Varric on the first transport out, he said. Flores is handling the documentation chain. Good. A pause. He looked at the canyon. 46 people entered the primary assault corridor this morning. 33 are alive and likely to stay that way. 3 are critical and I don't know yet. 7... He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. I've done casualty notifications before, he said. You don't get used to it. Anyone tells you they got used to it, they're either lying or they're someone you don't want running operations. Yes, 7 notifications. He turned a small piece of rock over in his hands. I'll think about what the number would have been if the canyon walls had come down. She didn't say anything. The cliff charges were pre-placed for weeks, he said. That was in your assessment to Marsh. You were listening. I was nearby. He looked at her. You weren't surprised by the scope of the fabrication. When Marsh told you the thermal analysis had been removed from the brief, you weren't surprised. She considered her answer. I was surprised by the specific mechanism, not by the fact of it. You came into this mission expecting the brief to be wrong. I came into this mission expecting any brief to be capable of being wrong. That's different. He was quiet, looking at the rock in his hands. The classification on your file, he said. Tier 2 asset, passive reconnaissance, limited authorization. He set the rock down. I want to understand what that actually represents. You'd need a clearance, you don't have to understand the full picture. I'm aware. He looked at her. Tell me what you can. She thought about it, not performing thought, actually deciding how much of this was useful to say and how much of it created complications she didn't need, and landing on the answer that some of it was useful and most of it was hers to keep. I spent 6 years in a unit that officially doesn't exist, she said. The work was specific. High-value targets in denied areas, no support, no extraction guarantee. The kind of work where you learn to function without confirmation because confirmation wasn't available. He was listening. When that unit was disbanded, which it was, for reasons that are classified and also genuinely complicated, the people who'd been in it got redistributed, reclassified. Some of them went back to conventional roles. Some got placed in positions that were described as appropriate to their adjusted capability assessments. Appropriate, he said. It's the word they used. And you think that classification was a deliberate misrepresentation? I think some people make decisions about what to write in files based on what's convenient rather than what's accurate. I think that happened in my case. She paused. I also think Marsh just told me it was done intentionally for operational reasons I don't fully accept but can't completely dismiss. He looked at her. You've been operating at Tier 2 level since the unit was disbanded? Yes. For how long? 2 years. He absorbed that. She watched him do the math. 2 years of someone with her apparent capabilities being placed in roles rated non-essential, limited authorization, secondary support. The math didn't produce a comfortable result, and he didn't pretend it did. Did anyone besides Marsh know? He asked. My direct handler, and the person who wrote the classification, who I've never met. The person at the 3rd clearance level, he said slowly. She looked at him. He was looking back with the expression of someone who had just arrived at a connection and was checking their work before saying it out loud. The person who modified the intelligence package, who removed the thermal analysis, who wanted this mission to proceed the way it nearly did. He held her gaze. If they were at the right level, they might have written your classification, or approved it. Or approved it, he said, which means they might have known your actual capability and deliberately kept you rated low, so that if the operation went wrong, you'd be in the right place to respond. He stopped, looked away, looked back, or so that you'd be in a position where responding was harder than it should have been, and the additional casualties were... He stopped again. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that didn't make the implication worse. Reed stood up. He walked 4 or 5 steps away and stood with his back to her, and she gave him that. When he turned around, his face was controlled, but the control was recent, and she could see the seams of it. I need you to tell me something, he said. Straight answer. Ask. If you'd been classified accurately, proper role, proper authorization, proper positioning and support, the Ridge assessment flagged and acted on, how many of those 7 do we keep alive? She thought about it honestly, the way he was asking her to. I don't know, she said. Maybe 2, maybe 4, maybe none of them. The ambush was well planned and the timing was coordinated, and there are things that happen in a canyon at that speed that no amount of correct classification prevents. She looked at him. But the cliff charges. If the thermal analysis had made it into the brief, the approach route changes. The column doesn't enter the kill zone in the same configuration. She paused. I think the column doesn't enter the kill zone at all. He was very still. Then we breach the facility from a position of strength, she said, with proper support and a brief that matches the actual threat environment. And the casualties? Unknown, but lower, probably significantly. He stood with that for a moment. Marsh is going to run a formal review, he said finally. The intelligence modification, the clearance chain, the classification decisions. I've been asked to contribute a field assessment. I know. My field assessment is going to be accurate. He looked at her. All of it. She looked back at him. That's going to create problems for you. Probably. The person at the 3rd clearance level, if they're still active, if they have the kind of access Marsh is suggesting, a field assessment from a colonel that contradicts decisions made at that level is going to attract attention. Yes, he said. It is. She studied him, looking for the hesitation she expected to find, the particular calculation that people made when accurate became expensive. She didn't find it, which told her something about Reed that she filed in the same place she'd been filing things about him since she came down off the ridge and found him in the canyon with his wounded arm and his head count and the weight of 7 notifications waiting for him. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. He started walking back toward the main element. After a few steps, he slowed without stopping. The counter sniper. On the South Ridge. He cooperated. Yes. He gave you the fob, the code, the facility commander's location. Yes. And then he was still there when the extraction team reached the ridge. Was he? Alive, shoulder wound, blood loss, coherent enough to give his name and nationality when asked. Reed kept walking, not looking back at her. He's in custody. He'll be part of the intelligence review. She said nothing. His testimony about the operation, Reed said, about what he was told versus what he found when he got here, about the damper. He paused. It's going to be important. She thought about the man on the ridge who had looked at the helicopter lights and made a decision she hadn't expected, and before that had closed a damper that his employer had told him to keep open, and before that had declined to take a shot at an unconscious man lying in the cold. I imagine it will be, she said. Reed walked on. She stayed where she was for another minute, watching the canyon settle into the particular quiet that followed violence. Not peace, not absence of threat, just the cessation of the specific immediate pressure that had been the world for the last several hours. Her hand was throbbing. Her shoulder was worse. She was cold in ways she could catalog and cold in ways she couldn't. Flores appeared from the direction of the aircraft. He was carrying a thermos and had the somewhat dazed expression of someone who'd been on radios for 2 hours and was only now remembering that he had a body that required maintenance. He held the thermos out without saying anything. She took it. Hot water with something dissolved in it. Not coffee, not tea, something functional and graceless that tasted like a field kitchen's best attempt at hydration and warmth. She drank half of it. The signal's element, she said. The burst transmission I sent from Okafor's unit. Did that reach anyone? Flores looked at the thermos rather than at her. It reached the QRF staging element at the pass entrance. The jamming was partial by that point. Your burst got through about 60% degraded. He paused. It was enough to vector the gunships. She nodded. The QRF commander, Flores said. When we got the burst, he asked for a sender identification. He paused again. The ID code that came through was Okafor's unit, so we logged it as Okafor's transmission. She looked at him. He looked back, and his face was doing the same thing Reed's had done. The recalibration, the small adjustment of a category. The after-action report, he said carefully. It's going to ask about the burst transmission. Log it accurately, she said. He nodded. Yes, Sergeant. He hesitated. The thermal analysis, your contact report from before insertion, the original flagging of the ridge positions. That's in the intelligence review. Marsh has it. I know, He stopped. It was in our system, the flag. For 47 minutes before insertion, it was in our system and it didn't reach the colonel. He was quiet. I should have pushed harder on the acknowledgement. She looked at him. He was 20-something, good at his job, and was doing what people did when events gave them time to identify the moments where a different choice might have mattered. You transmitted on 3 frequencies, she said. Yes. Including the emergency channel. Yes. The jamming was already active. I know, but Flores, she held his gaze. You did your job. The system failed. Those are different. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, not like he fully believed it yet, but like he was willing to carry it toward believing it. She handed back the thermos. She stood up from the rock and her body registered a comprehensive complaint about every decision she'd made in the last 14 hours. And she acknowledged the complaint and set it aside, and she walked back toward the aircraft. General Marsh was standing near the transport ramp, talking with 2 intelligence personnel. She saw Elena coming and finished her sentence and waited. Elena stopped in front of her. The person at the 3rd clearance level, she said. When you find them. Marsh waited. I want to be in the room. Marsh looked at her, the managed expression, the careful allocation, then, that's not standard protocol. No. You'd be a witness, a primary field asset from the compromised operation. There are conflict of interest arguments. Yes. Arguments I would have to override. Yes. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. The canyon air moved between them, cold and dry and smelling of propellant and the coming dark. I'll consider it, Marsh said. Elena held her gaze. That's not a no, Marsh said. I know, Elena said. It's also not a yes. She walked up the transport ramp. The transport aircraft smelled like military-grade insulation and old coffee and the specific staleness of recycled air that had been breathed by too many people under too much stress. Elena found a seat along the starboard wall, strapped in, and closed her eyes before anyone could start a conversation she didn't have the reserves for. She didn't sleep. She didn't expect to. But she kept her eyes closed for the 40-minute flight and let the engine noise fill the space where thought would otherwise go. And that was enough. Okafor was on the same aircraft, on a medical litter secured to the forward bulkhead. She'd checked on him before strapping in. He was sedated now, proper sedation administered by the flight medic rather than the unconsciousness of a head injury, and his color was good and his breathing was regular, and the medic had used the word stable twice, which was the word she'd been waiting for. Varric was in the rear compartment, separated by a partition, with Torque sitting outside the partition door doing the kind of quiet, patient watching that Torque appeared to be exceptionally good at. Marsh sat across from Elena with a tablet and didn't speak. Reed sat 2 seats down from Marsh and stared at the floor for most of the flight, not in the way of a man who'd shut down, but in the way of a man doing accounting, the long private arithmetic of command, adding up what had happened and what it meant and what came next and what he was going to have to say to 7 families. Elena kept her eyes closed and let all of it exist in the space around her without engaging any of it. When the aircraft landed, she opened them. The Coalition forward operating base was built into a valley 18 kilometers from Ravenspine Pass, a collection of hardened structures and temporary facilities that had the particular organized chaos of a place that had been told it was temporary for long enough that it had started acquiring the habits of permanence. Lights were on everywhere. It was evening now, the sky outside the aircraft a deep blue-gray that was about 30 minutes from full dark. They were met on the tarmac by a medical team, an intelligence reception element, and a man Elena recognized from a photograph she'd been shown 14 months ago at a classified facility in a city she'd been transported to without being told the destination in advance. Deputy Director Callum Hess. He was the 3rd clearance level. She understood that the moment she saw him, not because of anything dramatic in his appearance, he was a mid-sized man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a Coalition Intelligence Liaison jacket over civilian clothes, but because of the way he looked at Marsh when Marsh came down the ramp. The look of a man assessing whether what he'd expected to see was what he was seeing, the look of someone running a calculation. Elena came down the ramp behind Marsh and watched Hess run that calculation and watched the precise moment when his eyes found her, and the calculation produced a result he didn't like. He controlled it. He was good. But she'd spent 6 years reading the micro-expressions of people who had just realized something had gone wrong, and Callum Hess had just realized something had gone wrong. Marsh stopped in front of him. Callum, Lena. He looked from her to Elena to Reed, who was coming down the ramp behind them. I wasn't expecting such a full manifest. No, Marsh said. I don't imagine you were. 2 intelligence personnel appeared from the building to Hess's left. They weren't liaison officers. Their posture and their positioning, flanking, attentive, hands visible and available, communicated something specific to anyone who knew the language. Hess looked at them. He looked back at Marsh. This is premature, he said. His voice was steady. A man who'd had contingencies for contingencies. You have indicators, not evidence. Whatever happened in that canyon today is field noise. You can't build a chain from field noise to a 3rd-level modification without... The fabricated imagery has a creation timestamp, Marsh said. The metadata wasn't scrubbed correctly. It was created 14 minutes after the real imagery was removed from the package, using a workstation that logged to your directorate's secure server at 0340 on the 17th. Hess said nothing. You were logged into that workstation, Marsh said. You personally. Not a subordinate, not a compromised credential. You. The tarmac was cold, and the wind off the valley walls moved between them with the particular indifference of weather that doesn't know what it's passing through. I want a lawyer, Hess said. You'll have one, Marsh said, after the operational debrief. I don't consent to... Callum. Marsh's voice didn't change temperature or volume. It simply became the kind of voice that ended sentences. 98 Coalition Special Operations personnel entered a canyon this morning based on an intelligence package you modified. 7 of them are dead. A chemical weapons facility very nearly vented over a civilian settlement. She held his gaze. You will participate in the debrief. Hess looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. She looked back. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, she thought, or not only guilt. Something more specific. The look of a man confronting the single variable that had unmade a plan he'd considered comprehensive. You were rated non-essential, he said. Directly to her, not to Marsh. To her, as if explaining something that should have been obvious. I know, she said. The role was designed to keep you contained. Your profile. If you'd been given appropriate positioning, I know what you designed it to do. He stopped. You approved my classification, she said. 2 years ago. You saw the real file and you wrote the box that said Tier 2 Passive Limited Authorization because if I was rated correctly and assigned correctly and given proper operational authority, the kind of thing that happened in that canyon today would have been a lot harder to arrange. He didn't deny it. The 7 people who died this morning, she said. You knew there'd be casualties. That was the plan. You ran dispersal models on the village. You knew that too. The village was outside the primary effect zone, he said. The same words Varric had used. Different voice, same calibration. She looked at him and thought about how many people she'd met who could say something like that and believe it and keep believing it. And she thought that the number was always higher than it should have been and lower than it probably was. Take him inside, Marsh said to the 2 intelligence personnel. They did. Elena watched him go. She stood on the tarmac in the cold and watched Callum Hess walk into the building under escort, and she felt not satisfaction, not the clean resolution that the word justice implied. Something more complicated and less comfortable than that. The recognition that a thing which had been wrong had been corrected, and that the correction didn't restore anything it had undone, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and you carried both of them. Reed stopped beside her. You knew it was him, he said. I suspected. When Marsh described the clearance level and the access required, I had a short list. He was on it. You didn't say anything. I didn't have confirmation. Saying a name without confirmation in a situation like this creates problems that are sometimes worse than the original problem. He was quiet for a moment. 2 years ago, when you were reclassified. He was at the directorate level by then. I don't know if he was the person who saw the opportunity or if someone positioned him specifically to manage it. That's what the review will determine. And your unit, the one that was disbanded. She looked at him. That one's going to stay classified. He nodded. He wasn't going to push it. She'd known he wouldn't. For what it's worth, he said, the field assessment I submit. It's going to be specific about the classification discrepancy, about what Tier 2 authorization meant in practice today versus what it should have meant. Reed, I know it creates complications. For you, not for me. My complications are already in motion. For both of us, then. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was direct and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, which was maybe what happened when a man had been through what they'd been through together in the space of a single day. You saved my element. You saved the village. You saved the whole operation from becoming the thing it was designed to become. He paused. The people who put you in a non-essential box, Cito, that's the record I want corrected. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. She meant it, and she didn't add anything to it, because some things reduced when you added more. He nodded once. He walked toward the building. She stayed on the tarmac. The debrief took 9 hours. It was conducted in a secure room on the building's second level, rotating participants, multiple recording systems. Elena sat through most of it, was asked to leave twice while classified compartments were addressed, and was brought back in both times within 20 minutes. She answered every question with the precision she'd been trained to bring to after-action reporting. Specific, sequential, without interpretation unless interpretation was explicitly requested. At 300 the following morning, Hess's lawyer arrived, and the formal questioning of Hess began in an adjacent room. Elena could hear nothing through the wall, which was the point, but she could see the face of the junior intelligence officer who walked in and out of that room over the following hours, and the progression of that face across the night, from neutral, professional, to something tighter, more compressed, told her that Hess was not finding the angles he needed. Marsh appeared in the debrief room at 0430 and sat down across from Elena for the first time since the tarmac. "He's talking," she said, "to reduce exposure." "Yes, he's naming the person who recruited him, someone outside the Coalition Directorate. The scope of this is—" She stopped, which was unusual for Marsh. "Larger than I assessed." Elena waited. He was recruited 4 years ago. The operation against Reed's element was the culmination of a longer access program. Intelligence modifications across 6 operations over 3 years, each one calibrated to degrade Coalition capability in this region by increments that wouldn't individually trigger a review. "Incremental degradation," Elena said. "Each modification small enough to be explainable as error or judgment call. Until the final operation was large enough to do significant structural damage, and they had enough access to make it look like operational failure rather than sabotage. And my classification was part of the access program from the beginning. He identified you after the unit disbanded as the asset most likely to disrupt a sufficiently complex operation in this region. Keeping you rated low and limited was a specific precaution." Marsh held her gaze. "He was right about what you were capable of. He was wrong about what he could prevent." Elena sat with that. "The review of your classification begins formally in 6 days," Marsh said. "It will be expedited given the circumstances. The outcome—" She paused. "I think you understand what the outcome will be." "I'm not going back to the unit," Elena said. Marsh looked at her. "The unit doesn't exist anymore. I'm not going back to whatever it becomes." She looked at the table surface, then back up. "I'm not going back to a passive role either. Non-essential, limited authorization, that's done." "Yes," Marsh said, "it is. I want operational authority commensurate with my actual capability. Proper positioning, proper support, proper role definition. And I want it in writing, specifically in a classification document that exists in more than one system, so it can't be quietly modified by the next Callum Hess without generating a discrepancy audit." Marsh looked at her for a moment, the managed expression, and then something that moved behind it. Something that might have been, in a different kind of face, close to respect. "That's a specific ask," she said. "I've had 9 hours in a debrief room to think about it." "I'll have the framework drafted before the formal review," Marsh said. "You'll see it before it's finalized." Elena nodded. "There's one more thing," Marsh said. She set a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a summary document, your classification markings at the top, a brief paragraph of text, a signature line at the bottom. "The field commendation. For what happened in the canyon and the facility, Reed submitted it at 0200. I've co-signed." She looked at Elena. "It will be part of your file." Elena looked at the paper without picking it up. "It's not a restoration," Marsh said. "It doesn't undo the 2 years." "No. But it's accurate. And from this point forward, accurate is what your file will be." Elena picked up the paper, read it, set it back down. She didn't say anything for a moment. There was a particular feeling that came with being seen accurately after a long period of being seen wrong. And it wasn't the clean, bright feeling that movies suggested. It was more complicated. Relief and something that was adjacent to grief. Because to feel relief about being correctly seen, you first had to have spent time being incorrectly seen, and the relief didn't cancel that time. It just coexisted with the memory of it. "Okay," she said. Marsh stood. "Get some sleep." "After I check on Okafor." Marsh looked at her. "He's stable. The medic's updated at 0200. "I know. I still want to check." Marsh left her with the paper on the table and the recording equipment dark and the debrief room quiet around her. Okafor was in the medical bay on the ground floor, one of 6 operators in a row of beds. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular heaviness of people sleeping through pain with pharmaceutical assistance. A single-duty medic sat at a desk near the door reading something on a tablet and looked up when Elena came in and looked back down without saying anything. She went to Okafor's bed. He was asleep. His face was relaxed in a way she didn't often see it. The awake version of Okafor was alert and calibrated in the manner of someone who'd learned to treat most environments as potentially adversarial. The sleeping version looked younger. Looked like whatever he'd been before the work had found him, and he'd found it. She sat in the chair beside his bed. His left hand was resting on top of the blanket. She looked at it and thought about the moment on the ridge when she'd asked him to squeeze and felt the faint response. And she thought about the 11 hours they'd spent flat in the cold watching the canyon before anyone else arrived, and the particular grammar of working with someone in conditions that didn't permit conversation. The communication through small signals, the trust built from hundreds of small reliable choices accumulated over time. He opened his eyes, not startled, just open, the way people woke sometimes when they'd been sleeping lightly. "Cross," he said. Better than on the stretcher, clearer. "You're at the FOB, medical bay." He looked at the ceiling. "Head hurts. You have a mild concussion and 2 fragment wounds. The concussion is the one they're watching." "How mild?" "Mild enough that you're coherent and your pupils are normal." He processed this. "The canyon." "Resolved." "Define resolved." "Ambush neutralized, facility secured, chemical stores contained, Varick in custody, Hess in custody." He turned his head toward her slowly. "Hess. Deputy Director Callum Hess, 3rd clearance level. He modified the intelligence package. He also approved my reclassification 2 years ago." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. She watched him take that in and organize it, the way he organized everything, methodically, without visible reaction until the organization was complete. "He's the reason your file says what it says," Okafor said. "Yes." "And the reason you were rated non-essential." "Yes." He looked at the ceiling again. His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm going to be very professional about this. I'd appreciate that. Inside, I am not being very professional about this." "I know. I appreciate that too." He was quiet again. Then, 7. She'd known he'd get there. He was a thorough person. "Yes." "How close was it?" "Cliff charges in both walls. Manual trigger in the command bunker. I disrupted the primary trigger twice, and Hess's team had arranged a secondary circuit and a sabotage damper in the facility exhaust system." She paused. "It was close." He absorbed that. "The village." "Clear." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated regard of someone who'd worked alongside her long enough to be past the point where complicated was necessary. "Your hand," he said. "Stitched." "Your shoulder." "Bruised, not broken." They checked. "The rest of you." She looked at him. "Getting there." He nodded. It wasn't a small nod. It carried something in it, the particular acknowledgement of a person who had worked alongside you through something and knew that getting there was the accurate answer, and the honest one, and was therefore better than fine or okay. "Reed's field assessment is going in," she said. "The classification review starts in 6 days. Marsh is committed to a new framework." "In writing?" "In writing." He nodded again. "Good." A pause. "I want it on record that I flagged the ridge thermal analysis deficiency. Your transmission is in the record. And the jamming, also in the record. And the fact that your contact report was transmitted correctly on 3 frequencies and was prevented from reaching Reed's planning cell by active jamming that had already been deployed before the column inserted." She looked at him. "Is there anything else you want on record?" "Not yet. I'll think of more after I sleep." He closed his eyes. Then, without opening them, "Elena." He almost never used her first name in a professional context. It landed differently than Sergeant Cross or Cross. "Yeah," she said. "I'm glad you went down." She sat with that for a moment. "You told me not to," she said. "I know what I said." His voice was getting slower, the medication or the fatigue pulling him back under. "I'm still glad you went." She sat there until his breathing evened out, and she was certain he was properly asleep and not the wrong kind of unconscious. Then she stood up and looked at him for a moment in the way you looked at people you'd come close to losing and hadn't. She walked out of the medical bay. There was a window at the end of the ground floor corridor that faced east, and through it, the valley was transitioning from full dark to the first gray suggestion of dawn. Not light yet, just the sky's announcement that light was coming. Elena stood at that window and looked at it. The last 36 hours moved through her in no particular sequence. The 11 hours flat on the frozen ridge, watching a canyon that already knew what was going to happen to it. Okafor going down. The notch and the counter-sniper's voice and the footsteps on the ridge above her. The drainage cover and the mechanical clunk of a damper closing. Varric's institutional face and his wind dispersal models. Hess on the tarmac, running the calculation that had finally come up short. The 7. She stayed with the 7 for a longer moment than the rest. The way you had to. The way you owed to anyone whose name ended up in a count. Then she thought about the 33 who walked out. The 12 walking wounded. The critical cases who were stable as of last update. The technical staff in the facility who hadn't known what they'd been placed inside. The village 14 kilometers northeast that had woken this morning to a cold, ordinary day and gone to sleep tonight not knowing how close it had come to being something else entirely. She thought about the counter-sniper, whose name she still didn't know, whose file would be somewhere in the intelligence review process, whose shoulder wound was being treated somewhere in this building according to Torque, who had mentioned it in passing with the tone of someone who found the situation complicated and didn't feel like fully articulating the complication. She stood at the window until the gray in the east became something that could honestly be called light. Her hand throbbed. Her shoulder was going to be worse tomorrow when the adrenaline residue finished metabolizing and left the pain without the cushioning of anything chemical or purposeful. She was going to sleep for a long time when she got to a bed, and she was going to wake up and eat something substantial, and she was going to begin the process of the next thing. The review, the new framework, the proper classification, the work that came after having the right tools restored to you. But right now she stood at the window and watched the light come into the valley and let it be what it was. Reed found her there. She heard him coming down the corridor. She always heard people coming. It was not something she could turn off, and she'd stopped trying years ago. And when he stopped beside her, he didn't say anything immediately, which was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't fill silence with words just to fill it. They stood there together for a minute, looking at the valley. "Notifications," she said, not a question. "Did them an hour ago." His voice was level, but level in the way things were level when they'd been deliberately placed. 4 of them were awake. 3 I had to wake up. She nodded. "The hardest one was a woman who already knew," he said. "Before I said anything. You could hear it the moment the call connected. She knew, and she waited for me to say the words anyway, because that's the protocol. That's how it goes." He was quiet. "I said the words, and she thanked me. She thanked me for calling." Elena looked at the light in the valley. "That one's going to stay with me," he said. "Yes," she said. "It will." He looked at the window for a moment more. Then he looked at her. "The review panel wants a preliminary field statement from me by end of week. I'm going to write it tomorrow." "I know." "I'm going to include everything. The classification discrepancy, the thermal analysis, the contact report, the ridge positions, the engagement authorization, everything." "Read." "Yes. Write it accurately. All of it, the way it happened, without making it into something it wasn't. Don't protect me and don't reduce me. Just accurate." He looked at her for a moment. "Accurate is what I do." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it to you instead of someone else." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one. The expression of someone who was going to get there eventually. He walked away down the corridor. She stayed at the window. The light was fully in the valley now, filling it from the east, reaching the canyon walls and the ridge lines and the terrain that had been so cold and so violent a handful of hours ago and was now just mountains in the morning. They didn't look like anything had happened there. Mountains never did. They were indifferent in the way that large things were indifferent. Not cruel, not kind, simply there and old and unchanged by what small, fast-burning things passed through them. She put her right hand flat on the cold glass of the window. She thought about the voice of the woman Reed had called. The thank you at the end of the protocol. The way some people found grace in exactly the moments where grace seemed least available, and offered it to strangers who had come to them with terrible news, because that was the kind of people they were, or the kind of people grief had made them, or both. She thought about Okafor's first name, used in the dark of a medical bay. She thought about Hess running his calculation on the tarmac and arriving at the wrong answer, and the specific look on his face when he understood that. She thought about the lever in the command center and the solid mechanical clunk of the damper she'd turned with a bleeding hand, and the red light going dark. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong, the relief and the grief and the coexistence. She stood at the window with the light coming through it until she was done thinking about those things. Then she pushed off the glass and walked down the corridor toward the room they'd assigned her, and she took off her boots and her vest and the field jacket that needed to go straight into disposal, and she lay down on a bed that was too narrow and too hard and was absolutely fine. She was asleep in under 2 minutes. 6 weeks later, the formal classification review produced a document. It ran 43 pages and contained language that was specific and unambiguous about what Elena Cross was, what she was capable of, and what operational authority was commensurate with that capability. It was filed in 4 separate systems across 2 separate directorates, each with a discrepancy audit protocol that would flag any unauthorized modification within 48 hours. Hess was transferred to a formal detention facility pending prosecution on 7 counts, the lead count being conspiracy resulting in the deaths of coalition personnel. Varick was extradited. The person who had recruited Hess, whose name appeared in the documents but not in this story because some things belonged in the record and not in the retelling, was identified, located, and removed from any position of access within the month. Okafor's concussion resolved cleanly. He returned to duty status 5 weeks after Ravenspine and submitted a request to continue as Elena's operational partner, citing mission continuity and field compatibility. The request was approved at the first level of review, which was faster than either of them expected. Reed submitted his field assessment. Every word of it was accurate. The repercussions of that accuracy moved through the Coalition's Intelligence and Special Operations Directorate in ways that were slow and bureaucratic and real, the way institutional change always was. Grinding and imperfect, and unlikely to satisfy anyone who needed satisfaction quickly, but present, and moving in the right direction. The counter-sniper's name was Alexei Van. His cooperation with the intelligence review was substantial, his testimony specific, and his information about the network behind the Ravenspine operation was described by 3 separate analysts as invaluable. What happened to him after that was a matter of classification that Elena didn't have access to, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was able to live with not knowing. The village 14 kilometers northeast of Ravenspine Pass had a cold and ordinary winter. The people in it went about their days in the specific, dense way of people who have no idea how close things came. That was fine. That was the whole point. Elena flew into a different mountain range 8 weeks after Ravenspine, for a different operation, in a different role. The role that the 43 pages said she was. Properly positioned, properly supported, properly authorized. She lay flat in a hide that she'd selected herself, at a time of day she'd chosen, in a position that gave her the field of view she'd assessed was necessary, and she waited. Beside her, Okafor ran the numbers on the rangefinder with the new battery and reported them clearly and waited with her. It was cold. It was always cold at altitude. She settled into the scope and watched the ground below and let her body go quiet, in the way it did when everything else dropped away and there was only the task and the patience and the long discipline of being exactly where she needed to be. The woman who nobody counted. The shot nobody saw coming. The force that changes everything. Not because it was loud, but because it refused to stop. The most dangerous thing in any room is the person everyone decided didn't matter.